So I'm not going to just make you stare at slides the whole time. We'll look at a lot of websites, but so that means you got to learn by writing things down when you hear them. And so feel free to interrupt if I say a website name or some other thing. How do you spell that? It always,
Printing or cursive?
I'm trying to resurrect the lost art of cursive, so I think that's good. Plus, my kids can't read it when I write cursive. So,
you get bonus points if you can do it in calligraphy.
I never did figure out how to do that. So this course is about podcasting and podcasting for your business. Now, first off, and how many of y'all attended the social media session last time? A lot of folks, right? Because we'll talk about some of that a little bit, and there's a little bit of overlap there, right? And so first off, you all know we got episode shooting. I have a podcast. I started podcasting about probably right before the pandemic, maybe about 6 years before the pandemic started, something like that. I guess it was 2018. Started doing that, got up to about 50 episodes and so forth. I've still got some to put out there. I've got a backlog. Need to get back into it now that we're reopening and stuff post-pandemic. But for me, it's really opened up a lot of doors, created a lot of opportunities, given us a lot more exposure and voice. And I think it's a really powerful medium because people want to be engaged. They want to listen to long-form content that really, everything in the world is not 15-second video clips, right? And there's some interesting things about podcasts if you look at like statistics. And I talked about this a little bit from the podium last week. Some of the biggest markets for podcasting are folks that everyone would agree are, in the prime of their profession and their careers, 40 and up, right? It's not so much the teenage market. Those folks are watching 1-minute TikToks and stuff, right? Which are fun, but how much can you really learn from that versus sitting down with a real expert for an hour, right? And learning the ins and outs of the way some fascinating market works, right? That's the sort of stuff that us business nerds are into, right? Which everybody in Rotary, I think, qualifies as that. Yeah. We enjoy learning about markets and industries, right? So the fastest growing markets are 40, 50 plus. Some of those markets grow 20, 30% a year still. And earlier, in 2019 through 2020, they were tripling every year, and it was really exploding. And certainly, like anything else, if you were the first mover and you launched a podcast in 2010, and you were one of 1,000 or something, or one of 10,000, you had more listeners. Now it's much more crowded. There's something like, there's several 100 million podcasts out there. There's millions being added every year. And so it's not something you can just put out there per se and people will just find, but it still has a lot of value as a promotional tool and other reasons. So other statistics is like something like 80% of listeners, if they're listening to, most podcasts are longer, right? They're not 5-minute shows. It's sort of frowned upon, right? Most of them are 30 minutes, hour. Joe Rogan shows are 4 hours long. 4 hours, I don't know if y'all ever listened to his shows. He's a very well-known podcaster and videocaster, but his average show length is 4 hours, right? And 80% of people listen to those all the way through, okay? So it's something that you get really engaged in when you listen to them, right? And you have to find ones you like. There's other advantages of a medium too, is, if you think about it, if you want to get exposure for your message, for your personal brand, for your business, whatever it is you're doing this for, if you are buying ad space on YouTube videos, everybody's going to skip those. Nobody wants, and that's 10-second distractions, right? Nobody watches those, right? If you write a blog post, if someone wants to read it, maybe somebody will, and there are big people that are into blogging, but you have to sit down at your computer, read the words. It takes, and especially if it's a long post, you have to be not distracted, right? If you're watching a video, if you say, well, I'm going to invest in doing a video series on YouTube, people have to be, who has time to stare at their screen and watch an hour-long video, right? But if you're with a podcast, you can drive, mow the lawn, work out, do housework, sit here and listen to it while you work, and so I think that's part of the reason why people like to kind of consume that form of media. Right? So I started out, very basic kind of questions here. I broke it down to 10 points. So, first off, has everyone here listened to a podcast before? Or is anyone who hasn't listened to a podcast?
I have never
Okay.
listened.
So, a podcast is just another name for an audio recording on the internet. It's
Like a radio show.
It's very similar to a radio show. There's some that are drama and theater. There's a podcast out there that's complete works of Shakespeare. And every episode is a different act, right? And they're just going through, And there's some that are game shows, some that are music shows, but anything that could be on the radio, right? You can listen to it on your phone, on your computer, on your watch, in your car, anywhere that has an internet streaming access. And key to kind of understanding podcasts is, there's all these directories out there, okay? And there's some really trusted ones. Some of them are kind of private and you can pay, others are public. But the more you're in, the more your access to listeners you're going to get, right? So you may have heard, obviously, of like Apple Podcasts. They have millions and millions. And really, iTunes or Apple Podcasts is really the main thing to worry about getting your show in, because 90% of every other directory just steals what Apple posts and recycles it, right? But there's also Spotify, you may have heard of. There are a lot of shows on Spotify that you're either going to have to watch an ad to listen to, or you have to pay to join. There's also kind of like little private premium networks like Wondery, for instance, that they say premium podcasts, and if you want to listen to their shows, you gotta get a subscription. People do that, and they have better content. Movie stars, real people spending money on making these podcasts, right? So there are those premium networks as well out there. Though again, you gotta kind of really be a professional to get into this, to get listening. So for the most part, anything you're doing in the business world, you're going to get on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and then try to get on other networks as well. Okay? And if you're on your computer here in Apple Podcasts, obviously it has a whole player interface, and you can see every podcast has episodes, right? Everything is episodic in nature. And you can see each episode has like a title here. So let me think. Let's find a good example, maybe. I don't know. So here's a podcast about the Amazon story called Foundering. Okay. And they have seasons and they have episodes, much like TV shows. It's a little different than radio, because like radio, there's no, you know what I mean? There's not seasons to radio exactly. They can have trailers here, and you can see you always try to kind of put what number and what order show you're in, so that people can go and say, if they listen to part 2, they can find part 1. Okay. In this player here, obviously, the play button.
Jeff Adams is a computer scientist. In 2011, he was at
It plays. You can download the files sometimes in these interfaces. You can, if you look up here, there's always like descriptions, and you'll notice there's a description of the show here, a title to the show. There's also artwork for the show. Okay, so these are all things you're going to need if you want to do a podcast. Okay. Any questions so far?
So why would you listen to a podcast rather than read the Atlantic Monthly?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's, and interesting, if you look at the Atlantic Monthly, most of those shows, most of those articles also have an audio version you can listen to now, the New Yorker does. I think it's, obviously there's an enjoyable aspect of sitting down with a magazine and reading it, but again, I think it's a little bit of that multitasking thing people like to do. And also just, really hearing the conversation. It's just a different
And you
form.
can do it when you're driving, and we're all commuting 45 minutes each way every day.
And there is a little bit of like, there's no reason not to read the magazines and stuff, but there's a little bit of, like when you get your new magazine in the mail, you're like, oh great, I want to read it, I just got it, showed up, you're excited. And podcasts sort of have that too. You get the alert on your phone. Hey, new episode available. Oh, cool. I want to see what's happening this week, right? So you do have that little bit of a, subscription thing going on. But a lot of times they'll also have, for instance, interviews with the guy that wrote the article.
Yeah.
And that conversation, if it's a 3-hour conversation, is much more in depth than the article probably was, because the article is probably not 90,000 words, right? And that's kind of interesting too when you transcribe these things. I mean, it's 150,000 word transcriptions because they're long, right? So yeah, good question.
So Sam, if you wanted to have a podcast, I know there's individuals, for whatever reason, business or whatever the reason is, have a podcast. You have to find a site to host it, right? Somebody has to host it so it can get out there, kind of made public.
Yep, yeah, and that's what that is in this list here I'm going to look at and show you too. And so, let's see, is that next? That's going up.
Well, so get us to one of your podcasts.
Yeah.
You there that you can easily find you?
Yeah, so if I search so I'm listed in iTunes. And you can see there's our graphic and stuff go up here.
Is that what you are, Unstoppable?
Yeah. So that is my podcast that I made for my company, Unstoppable Software, right? And the purpose of this, so I think my next point here a little bit was what should my podcast be about, right? So what I was like, okay, here's my thing. I'm a software development company. I don't want to just have a podcast talking about the newest, neatest, programming language thing, because I don't think anyone, even programmers, want to listen to that really. Not for 3 hours, that my market, that I want to get exposed to is not programmers. That's not who, I want to get exposed to. Who I want to hear me talk and learn about, what I know or what my network is about is, leadership of companies that might have some technology problem that they might hire us to solve, right? Particularly folks who are looking to innovate and be innovative people, because that's a good prospect for me if they're like, I got a job at this furniture company and we have nothing and I want to get iPads and stuff. Well, I can help that person. So maybe they want to learn about innovation, right? And so what I said is, to create content, I will interview other innovative people so that people are interested in their ideas, listen to it, and that creates exposure for both of us, right? And with these kind of interview shows, which are a very popular format, you gain the benefit of, so if I interview Russell, well, maybe Russell's friends in his whole network listen to that, they hear me talk, plus my network's hearing him talk, so you kind of merge networks for a little bit of people, you're getting that joint exposure. And I have had people that don't know him at all say, oh, I listened to that, I saw you had, that minister, preacher man back on, talking to him. And I've had occasion where they're like, that was really cool because we're trying to do a live streaming video thing too, and he had it figured out, So people don't know him at all, heard him, right? So it's it's an exposure thing from the standpoint of different groups of people hearing you, is part of the goal of an interview-based show. Now you could also have a show where you say, look, I think about somebody like Tony Robbins, right? Everybody familiar with him, motivational speaker. He doesn't need to interview people, right? He can just sit down on a microphone and say, here's what I think about leadership, and talk for 60 minutes, and he's famous enough that everybody will listen, and he's got content ideas. He's just reading a chapter of his book. I mean, there are podcast people just reading chapters of their books, right? That's not really me, per se, so I wanted to do it.
So do you get a daily update of how many people listen to this podcast versus that podcast?
Yeah.
Kind of track on a pretty regular basis.
You can, and you can track, there's all kind of statistics platforms built in. Some of them come with the hosting platforms. And that helps you get an idea. And sometimes it's spotty and it's hard to tell because just because someone downloaded an episode doesn't mean they listen to it, right? But yeah, you can. And you can see in our listing here, so we have 42 episodes and the last one was Steve King actually, and I'm a bit behind on getting more out there.
2021, right?
We kind of, what I found is I stood back a little bit when the election was going on, when COVID was going on, because I didn't think everybody wanted to be listening to business podcasts, and there's a lot of other distractions. So I kind of paused a bit on it, just with all those other distractions going on.
And so how do you decide whether to do a video blog or an audio blog?
Well, it's a good question. So there's people call this like a vidcast or, something like that. So like a video podcast. I think part of it is just, do you think that the video adds benefit? Some people do both. You can take the audio from the video and put it on iTunes and then put the video on YouTube, right? But I think it's, you can't really watch the video in the background, like we talked about. And then you also have to know you're doing with the camera, you have to look presentable, all this on video, which is actually harder than you think to not, to do well on camera. So I would say basically it's easier to do a podcast, right? And the thing is, if you mess up on video, imagine if, your wife walks across the room and yells at you or something. On a video, if you edit that out, you're going to go because you're not going to stay in the same place. In audio, you just can snip that out, nobody knows it. So there's better editing. So here's our show, and you can see a listing of all the episodes, right? And then every episode kind of has its own little info block. So I'll talk a little bit like what I did with terms of show structure. And most podcasts, there's an introduction or there's some kind of music, and then you introduce the person, and then you talk, and then there's some kind of an outro, right? And that's just what I do. And I was going to get into that later. But so I have a little bit of music that plays. Right. And then I do a little intro.
In times of change and market volatility, having sound financial advice is critical. Our guest today is Steve King, VP at WealthQuest.
Very official.
So it's out there listed. Now, you asked about the hosting. Okay. So, and everyone can go listen to Steve after this. So, you got to host a podcast somewhere. There's a couple different options there. If you are somewhat tech savvy or have a tech savvy person and you have a WordPress page and a website of your own, you can host it on your own website, which is what I do, because I have a WordPress site and I tie it all in. Okay. So there's plugins, and so I'm probably a little beyond to get into on this. But if you look at our Unstoppable podcast, it's hosted at unstoppablesoftware.com. Okay. And I like that because then, when I look at an episode here, all this content and words and everything for each episode I get credit for that for Google searches and all that kind of stuff, right? So I interviewed John Newhart. Some of you folks may know him. If somebody searches for John Newhart podcast, it's going to come to my website, right? So that's one way to do it. That's the harder way to do it, probably. The other way to do it that would get you out there is there's all kind of podcast hosts out there. One popular one is called Podbean. It's a free podcast hosting and monetizing platform. Okay. And basically they take care of everything for you. They give you a really easy interface to upload your audio, to upload your pictures, your images. They register on iTunes. They do all that for you. The downside is, all the content is hosted on them. So maybe your website doesn't get the traffic in the same way. But it is a lot easier.
Isn't there also a risk Podbean gets bought by somebody else, and then the terms of service instantly change,
Sure.
All your content is held hostage, could be held hostage.
Yeah. No, there definitely is risk to that.
Small risk.
Probably not huge. There's also ways, some of these free ones, you have to allow them to insert little ads into your shows and stuff. There's that kind of stuff. But if you just go out and Google, podcast hosting, there are a lot of options out there. And I would recommend anybody kind of new to it, look into this sort of option because it kind of saves you. Libsyn is another one that's really popular, Libsyn. I think some of these have paid versions. So, this one here is $5 a month, right? And 100 is, well, depends on how much storage you need for all your audio and stuff, right? But you can see they take care of the Apple Podcast. They give you a website to send people to. If you show up in their directories, you get all these benefits, and it is pretty easy. If you wanted to do it on your own web page, you got to plug in and set it up and integrate it. It's more work. And you can see in here though what it kind of looks like. Let's see here. Should have directory or something. So you can listen to them, on their website. So like here's one they host. All ears English. This is about English pronunciation. And so your podcast would look just like this on their site.
This is an all ears English podcast.
Artwork and they post all that for you.
Sam, have you found your podcast format changing over the 50 episodes? Is it evolving?
A little bit. Like I've tried to do some things to be more interesting. Like I did a couple where it was like me and my staff talking about something, where it was like 4 people instead of interviewing one person. I used to do like these little like advertisements in them, and I got rid of that, and so I mean, there's ways to mix it up, I'd like to do more than like a panel interviewing, like I talked about with you with Russell, like getting 3 or 4 people from completely unrelated industries and talking about something like, business ethics or something. So we're not talking about their business and stuff, we're talking about a concept, So there's ways to, that's all on the table.
I have a question. So I find this interesting. It's kind of like Audible where you read a book. I have problems paying attention to it myself, but do you have a specific target audience that would like an hour-long podcast versus reading an article in a journal or watching a 2-second Instagram rah-rah thing? I mean, do you have a targeted audience of the type of individual that can do that? Because I suspect different people, you can almost do anything you want right now to get information. It's almost too much. So are you targeting a specific type of person, or who's not on there?
Well, like I said, I don't know that if you were trying to appeal to, if whatever your business was, for the younger market, teenagers, 20-year-olds and stuff, if you were trying to sell, like Kings Island doing a podcast would be kind of not really be listened to by those folks probably. So the market is typically more 30 and up, 40 and up. Right? For me, for my podcast, I'm targeting, like I said, business leaders, organizations who want to innovate, and I promote it to those groups, like on LinkedIn, for instance, which is where obviously there's a lot of those people, and that's where we've really picked up and gotten a lot of listeners who want to hear about the type of stuff we're talking about, right? So it's kind of, and that's just my podcast, but. And it's obviously there's so many people out there on it. I mean, there's more podcast listeners than there are Netflix subscribers in the U.S., right? So I think the number was there's like 76 million Netflix subscribers. There's 80 million, and I think that's weekly listeners,
So
right?
it's not just for entertainment, that's what you're saying.
No. And so, I mean, and you look at like the podcast, what podcast do I listen to a lot, right? I mean, so I mean, there's things like This American Life that are like sort of news, storytelling type things. There's a couple recently about the Ukrainian war and stuff that I've been following and listening to, right? And then, the business ones I listen to are probably more about, like, I enjoy like ones that are stories of like, the famous people in business, right? Like the guy who started Kroger, or the guy who started whatever, right? So that's just what I listen to, but there's a lot of interest out there. And a big thing, of course, is if you can get people to listen who know your guest, like that's a big reason for them to listen, right?
And I believe one of the biggest drivers of growth for podcast, any given podcast, is the word of mouth recommendation. Most podcasters I listen to are always saying, if you like this, please share it with a friend. Please go out and rate us on Apple, because that's how we grow the podcast. I mean, most podcasters I've listened to are very upfront. Please share. And you know, part of the genius of what Sam does with the interview show is you're immediately exposing yourself to a whole bunch of new listeners that.
Yeah, like I've had some pretty interesting things happen. So like, I was working for a while with this, he was like a consulting coach, right? His name was Michael Zapersky. So I interviewed him, well, he interviewed me on his show, and then, so you do these like trading, right? And then I interviewed him on my show, okay? And then he said, hey, can I take, so he said, I really liked how that turned out. Now, at the time, I might have had like, a couple thousand listeners, but he had like 150,000 listeners, right, that he could track. So he said, could I take your show and then play it on my show, right? So I said, sure, So he took the audio file from mine and then like rebroadcast it on his with a little intro of him saying, hey, I had the opportunity to be interviewed and I wanted my listeners to hear me be interviewed, right? But then of course that meant they were hearing me too, right? I did another show, like there's actually firms you can hire to help you get interviewed, so I hired at one point this firm, and I got on shows that have 600,000 listeners or whatever to do that, and some of those guys then did my show, and then again promoted them being on mine, and you get all that kind of cross marketing stuff, and it's all this talking about like, a lot of those shows are about like leadership decisions, how did you grow your business, where did you start, stuff like that people are just interested in. So there's a lot of like sub-markets and listeners you might want to target. But I have found, generally speaking, that the people who have reached out to me, like I've had a couple, local companies reach out to me and say, well, I heard your podcast and we have this problem, right, that we want you to solve, we want to build some software or something. I think it's because they hear it and they're like, you seem to understand business. I understand business. I don't understand technology though. Maybe you can help me bridge that gap, right? And just people hearing your voice and and who you are and what you care about is a good thing too, right? So it is a personal branding opportunity, more than like any blog post probably, right?
So this answers a question. See, I used to listen to the teaching company, but I would download things and listen to it, and they seem to be struggling now. I keep getting all these notices, oh, we want you back. And it sounds like 5 or 10 years ago, you had a teaching company and you maybe got Audible. So, if you were driving along in your car and you wanted to listen to something besides AM radio, you had sort of a couple of choices. But now it sounds like the sky is the limit.
Oh, yeah, just for example, let's say you want to learn about stock options, right? And it is kind of like its own Google type thing. So the option genius, learn stock options, option trading, option alpha, option trading, real traders, marathon money. That's just these are just the top ones that Apple wants to show.
How do they so are they selling that though? Are they selling the top spot? No.
That's like
You say no?
That's all based on the amount of listeners and traffic they get. To the more popular ones. And then these you can see they're actually like
That's still that way.
search engine. Yeah.
And this is Apple.
This is Apple Podcasts, right? Which is the biggest. So it's like if you want to learn about options trading, what can you do? Well, you can Google it, read about it. You can go on YouTube, watch videos about it, or you can subscribe to a 96-part podcast about it with the next one.
You could go to the library and look it up.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you can get good at the Dewey Decimal System and get a book out of it. mean, it's just another
But
way to
again,
consume content.
this way you can learn while you're mowing the lawn, doing the dishes, driving to and fro.
And I think that is a little, it's like for people that are like, oh, I've been meaning to read that book and I don't have time for it. What if I could, I mean, that's the thing with Audible, right? I mean, I can listen to the audio book while I work, and then I feel like, oh, I read that book. Man, I listened to it.
And that's the thing, it is not, people don't read magazines anymore. You know, I take The Atlantic, I take The Economist, I read these things, but I'm listening to the history of World War I while I'm driving, and, you know, history of World War I, history of the British Empire, you know, health and wellness podcast.
Are those podcasts, or is that the teaching company? No,
that's this podcast. You know, people will take on these. There's any number of projects that some people will do them as passion projects.
Yeah.
Some people will do them as content marketing. Yeah, and that's you know what Sam is doing. It's not marketing rah. It's I'm going to add value. I'm going to give you value. Listen to the value that I have, and then you'll be more aware of the product and service that I have to offer.
There's a functional aspect to it as well. The Cincinnati Art Museum has a wonderful podcast, and not everybody can make opening night. Not everybody can be there when the speaker's there. Not everybody's a member, but they interview curators, they interview people associated with the exhibitions they're putting on, and people that they do are very talented. The good podcast people are exceptional at drawing out information and making for an entertaining interview. And so in their case, it's promotion, but it's also a supplement to what they provide the community, because you can listen to these things and have a deeper dive, so that when you go see the exhibit, it means more.
But it's also about time though too, right? Like so I search, you know, getting into med school, right? So there's always podcasts about, I mean, some of them about being in med school, pre-med. This is about people of color in medicine. This is about insider's guide on getting into med school. There you go. So does that person have time to write a book and find a publisher, get into the bookstore, get on Amazon? They don't have time. They're in med school, right? You know, but evidently, and it doesn't have to be high quality. I mean, some of these, it may just be a guy at his desk with a microphone, you know, and it's almost like, you know, he has time to do this, or as a hobby wants to do this, right?
Well, and also, what you're saying is, I mean, one of the concerns that has been surfacing is that local newspapers are just taking a dive, and I mean, it's probably being replaced by podcasts. So if you want to know about something,
But that's a good thing too. I mean, because newspapers are perhaps biased or influenced by other reasons that a podcaster might not. You know, you mix money into the equation, sensationalism in the equation. You know, think about like
the podcasters are not immune to sensationalism.
That's actually what I would ask is, how do you filter out what's real and what's not? I mean,
like any other.
I mean, well, but then you're not filtering, because you're selecting based on, I mean, that's tough.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you have to look, I mean, it's just like any other media content today. You know, you can't take everything at face value you see on Facebook or YouTube or on podcasts. I could find a dozen podcasts here about lizard people and how they're running the government, right? I guarantee you. You know, but I just think, you know, it's all about that commoditization and popularization of content, right? Because maybe I don't, you know, the local news guys, maybe I don't trust them, I don't like them, they're boring, whatever. I'd rather hear the guy who just has a podcast and there's these people, you know, who live in Cincinnati and they have a podcast and they just talk about what's going on, you know? So that's, and, you know, bias in media is a whole other discussion, but. So let's move on though. We talked about hosting options. You know, just briefly, I showed you a little bit of the artwork and details, and those are things that when you submit on a podcast and any of these things, you need to give them. Now, what I would say is, for a lot of these things, the easiest way to get help cheaply and affordably with some of these type of setup services, be it artwork, or even like later I talk about editing, there's a site I love called Fiverr, right? Anyone familiar with that? So it is a gig economy site, and you can go on Fiverr and say, all right, I want to do a podcast, so what do I need? I need podcast artwork. And there you go, podcast cover art, $15.
Podcast music.
Podcast intro music. Sorry, let me get people to walk in here. So podcast cover art, artwork. So these are folks that often are overseas, sometimes they're in the States, South America, and that's partly why it's so cheap. But it's a very controlled environment, very safe payment network. They don't get paid till Fiverr approves their payment. And, obviously, if you hire a local graphic design agency to design your podcast, you'll be paying more than $50, right? Which is hard to justify when you're starting out. So you get our podcast artwork, and then like Michael said, you say, well, I want to have an intro music, like my music. So I got intros and outros. What can this guy do?
Hey, what's going on? It's Ed Bishop. So you're a podcaster and you need a professional intro or outro for your podcast.
Now he's $100. So let's see, here's $20, right? So it's just an example of what these guys can do. Now what I then did, well, I'll come back to this. So that's where you can get set up for the music, the artwork, all that type of stuff you might need, okay? Well, then you're gonna have to actually record them, okay, which is why I brought some of this stuff. So first off, let's talk about in-person recording first, because that's probably the easiest thing to start out. You do have to invest in some equipment. It's not something that's going to sound very good if you record from your laptop microphones in your room. You can, and it is not horrible, but most people don't want to listen to that in their ears, right, in their earbuds. They want to have, some nice basso voices and, EQ and all this stuff. And so what I like and what most people use in the space are these little USB audio mixers and USB recording devices, okay? Now let me find my recording thing here. So there's a lot of free recording software out there. InTrack is one of them. There's various, any kind of like free open source recording software you want to use on your laptop works, okay? There's another one I'm looking for here that I'm blanking on the name. But basically, so you can see that this is picking up a microphone right now because the green bar is moving. So these devices, this is about $200 device, $250 device, plugs in with USB into your laptop, okay? And you just take that with you, or you bring that into your office. You plug in your microphone, and then you've got your interface microphone, like cable. So, you're talking about anywhere from $200 to $500 investment, maybe $300 investment. You can get by with a $50 microphone and be fine,
So this is just basically a little mixer board?
Yeah, it's a little mixer board, so you can see.
One input or two?
It's got 2 mic inputs or 2 line inputs, but yeah, 2 mic inputs. So I would bring another one and give you a mic. Now you're gonna want to get some headphones because you don't want to bleed over too much. So there's a little bit of work involved with that. I have like a separate headphone mixer thing I use for that. But you can just put a splitter on there too, So if we look at,
Sam, let me just ask let's suppose you're not doing an interview show, but it's just a solo show, you kind of monologuing and that kind of thing. Would it be sufficient just to get a USB mic and plug it directly into your laptop? Do you really need a mixer for something like that, or do you really just need the mixer when you're doing multiple?
Yeah, the mixer gives you the option of the 2 devices, right? So because Russell has a microphone, for instance, that it just comes straight out with the USB cable goes right in, right? So that's an option too. If you plan on it just being you on the show, right? And you could buy 2 of those, I guess, if you wanted to plug in 2 USB devices. But the point is, and there are a lot of guides online for kind of what kind of hardware and stuff you can buy, different microphones. But it's not a huge investment. It can be, if you start making it a hobby, you buy 2 new microphones. But,
Or you can upgrade the mixer board and start doing all the things a real mixer board can do with post-production work and things, and then you can just spend all the money you want.
yeah, and I started out with some cheap mics. I got a bunch of these mics, and those are pretty expensive because I just wanted to.
What about GarageBand? Have you ever tried GarageBand?
GarageBand's an option. Yep. Yep, those are all options. So if I do, let's set something up here. So pick my device here, and I'm just going to keep it on the back of the speakers. So if I start recording there, you can see the little line on it. Okay. Now, real brief, like overview of recording and stuff. So this microphone, as I turn up the volume on it, it will pick up everything in this room, and you can see it is hearing that right now. But when you have the volume cranked all the way up like that, it's picking up the entire room noise because it's listening really carefully, and it will hear. So like Steve, if you say something.
Hey, Sam.
Right. So you can see if I jump back here a bit. Listening really carefully. And it will hear. So like Steve, if you say something. Hey, Sam. But here it's really echoey and far away, and it just doesn't sound great. Okay. So what you want to do when you're using a microphone, here, Russell, this is the technique. You really kind of want to eat the mic. Okay.
Pay attention to this.
I think we should rely on the media professional here.
Yeah, right. So you want to get a couple fingers away from the mic, and just if you hear, give me the old test there. Start talking.
Space. The final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to seek out new life, new civilizations, but to boldly go where no man has gone before.
So if you listen to the way that sounds different.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to seek out new life, new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
It sounds much better, right? Versus what Steve and I did. So that is some mistake people do. Sometimes they just put it on the middle of the table and they think it's good. And then you get this noisy echoey thing. And so you do have to, you get a much better product if you get good equipment and you use good mic technique, which is to be close to it. Because microphones, the closer you are to them, the more bass there is. Okay, there's a relationship there between distance and so that timbre. So obviously there's a ton of videos and a ton of information on doing that recording process and everything, but I think that the main point is, for less than $500, you can get all the equipment you would need, whether USB devices, headphones, microphones, free audio software, like this one's called Audacity, which is probably the best known one, very cheap, or it's free actually, but works fine. So let's say you get all that and you record your show and you have 2 tracks on there, you learned how to do that, record your show. Well, now you're going to want to do some editing, right? Editing is a whole other thing that nobody has time to learn. So that's a good thing to outsource, right? So again, I go to my trusty Fiverr and I say podcast editing. Now editors can work magic, right? So if you give them stuff that's not that great, they'll fix it, right? So this guy says for $10 he'll edit and add background music to your podcast. So you hire these folks, you say, here's my audio files, and you talk to them and you say, well, I want some intro music and I want a rock and roll song as the intro, and I didn't like this part. At about 2 minutes in, I said something dumb I want to remove. You have that conversation via email, and they say, I got it, and then they deliver you back the finished result, right? So, if you listen to, for instance, my show, there's the music at the beginning, that the editor does all that, right?
Interesting. So he's been able to use a safe,
mixes in my intro,
to kill germs,
puts the music behind it, all that. He mixes that all together, right? And then at the end of the show, I said I want like an outro. So when we're done talking, so he mixed in.
Thank you for tuning.
And he actually does that voice.
Talking about telling us your story and what you do. It's obviously super relevant in today's world, and I really didn't have that great of an understanding of how widespread and the need was damaging.
We hope you enjoy.
Understanding.
I'll just show you the music.
How widespread
Where it fades
was
in.
what you're doing, by using either stuff that's damaging to us or the environment. So it's definitely super important. But yes, I thank you so
He
much
makes
for
in all that audio and bring it up. And he does the outro.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about it.
Thank you for tuning in to
Is that his
Unstoppable
voice?
Talk.
Thank you
We
for
hope
the
you
editor.
enjoyed today's podcast.
So
If
each
you
of your
did,
podcasts you send out for editing?
Yeah.
But you can edit yourself.
You can, it takes a lot of time.
What do you use to edit, or what do people use to edit themselves?
Well, I mean, you can edit in the audio client like this, Audacity itself. There's a couple other things you can use to edit. You can get some, like Adobe has recording and editing tools. We typically edit in the recording tool, right?
Right.
And there's ones that are nicer than Audacity. But I found myself spending like 2, 3, 4 hours of time editing and being picky and removing every little and every little throat clearing and everything else, which was too much really, because then it starts to sound unnatural, right? So he kind of saved me that, hour to 3 hours of time per episode where I was being picky, and just kind of got that all better and balanced, and there's cue and all these things to do. And I mean, I think I pay like, I told him, I was like, look, we'll do like 20 shows, I'll give you $20 per show, and so we worked out like a deal like that, right, or something. So you
And
do very cheap.
How often do you spend with him to tell him what you want when you think about the time that you invest in telling him what you want? How much time is that?
Really nothing at this point. He kind of knows
He
what I
just
want.
does it.
Like, I mean, at first I was like, there should be an intro, it should be 20 seconds, then I should come up. He used to do an intro too, actually. Like earlier episodes, he did the intro. Which I can show
So you
you.
establish a relationship and
Right.
they almost become further production.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And he kind of just knows. So I just send him the file, and he's like, and I say, do this the usual way, and I'll show you like, let's see if this one is one that he did the intro on, maybe.
On today's show,
That's still me. But he used to do the intros too, and I had different music. So at this point, once you work it out, I mean, it's not really that hard for them. They kind of know what they're doing.
And when he edits, he's not taking out, in Toastmasters, we have the counter.
Right.
So he's not counting the ahs and knocking out every.
They will. They will if you ask them to.
Okay.
I mean, usually sometimes they'll say, I'll do up to 10 of those or something, or they'll figure out a way to price it, And if you're really picky, or you do that a lot, or there's just a really good dog barking, you can tell them all those things. I mean, sometimes I'll say, hey, the guest told me I didn't like, I've had people later say,
To take that part out.
you asked me about my first job, and I didn't like what I said, can you cut that out?
Yeah.
I wasn't happy with what my answer was. So I'll tell them that, they will. So,
What about if, like, you want a 30-minute podcast and you've gone 40 minutes with your guests? What do you do then?
well, there's no reason to really cut it off in 30 minutes.
You don't have to.
No, there's not really any downside or reason to not make it longer. There have been times that I'm like, I want to remove this entire 20-minute section here because it was completely off topic and it's going to be distracting. We started talking about whatever,
Yeah.
right? And so I've done that. But typically speaking, that's what's nice about it is you're not trying to hit some 10-minute window of,
Right.
whatever. And if you don't have, because a lot of people say like, well, if you want to do a video on YouTube, you should keep it under 5 or 10 minutes, right?
Right.
And you don't really have that limitation here because people don't mind it being long.
And it's okay if it's different lengths, like one day you're doing
Yeah.
a 15-minute and the next day you're doing 30 and.
It doesn't really matter. I think some people like it to be somewhat the same. But I mean, you look again at some of the big guys out there like Joe Rogan and stuff, he'll do 3 hours, 4 hours, 2 hours. He varies.
I mean, most shows do set general expectation, but
General.
it's general.
So, I mean, I try to keep mine to like 45 minutes to an hour, and it's sometimes you really get into it. But so editing Fiverr is great. Again, if you've got, which like I said, I would recommend probably most people use a hosted service. if you've got, once you have those files and they're all edited and cleaned up, you just go into your hosted service and you upload them, and then you launch your first episode. Now I mentioned the social media tie-in a little bit. Obviously, one of the best ways, I mean, you can't just say, okay, now I'm done. You're not done, right? You've got your audio out there, it sounds great. What are you going to do now? Well, you need to promote that episode to someone. Obviously, the best way, and how many of you saw a couple weeks ago, like on Facebook, somebody posted about Brian Vealauer being interviewed on my podcast? Did you see that posting? So I interviewed him in 2019, right? And then his social media person has repeatedly posted that on his website over and over. And I don't even know who that is, who this person is. But she keeps on posting it every so often. And then somebody in Rotary saw it and then they posted it on Facebook. So that's all happening kind of without my involvement, right? And so you can ask the person that you interviewed, hey, here's the link. Send this to your friends. Email it to your newsletter. Post it on your website, which is what Brian did. Email it to your blog subscribers, or like Russell has a blog, But I get probably pretty good listenership, like posting on LinkedIn with a little description of what it was about. Hey, I interviewed Steve. Hey, I interviewed Russell. This is what we talked about. And if you have enough followers on any of those channels, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, any of those, that's a good place to kind of start. And then, like Russell said, word of mouth. Like, hey, did you hear? I interviewed so-and-so. You might want to check it out. So those are all, you do have to kind of do a little bit of that effort.
Could you go back to launching? So let's say you've got your podcast done, it's edited, you like it. Now what do you do with it?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying is, so if you have an account on, say, like Libsyn, then if you have your artwork, which your artwork is for the whole show, it's not per episode.
Right.
You probably do want to write some little kind of intro or description for the show, which they don't really appear to have done on this one. But you need to come up with a show title. What am I going to call this show? What is it going to be? What's going to draw the eye, right? You don't want to just call it All Ears English episode 1743, and that's it. That won't be enough. So you see, these people said, this title was Speak English Fast with These Pronunciation Tips. Is that even good English? So speak English fast? Like faster. But you got the title, sometimes a little episode description, and then you upload all that into the hosting service, and that's what then you can publish.
So you upload to the hosting service, publish. And then you have a link to promote.
Right. And they'll say, here's a link to it. So you can see, for instance, so you can see here, for instance, this up here, I guess, really is the link to that show.
Yeah.
And then that's what you can send out to your friends, family, newsletter, email list. I mean, like something I did for a while is just like whatever my latest podcast show was, I would just put his signature in my email, any emails I'm sending, because that's the most content people get from me is emails. And so I just always got that, hey, if you're interested, here's episode 40,
Oh, that's a good idea.
and people click and listen to it.
One question, Sam. How do you prepare your guests in advance? Because sometimes it's best to be spontaneous in an interview, and other times you kind of want to have a feel for what direction it's going to take.
No, great question, and I have this in here, I guess, too, like being a good host to guests. So people, if they're being interviewed, they usually kind of want to know what am I being interviewed about, right?
Yeah.
So I have this. Podcast interview questions and framework that I kind of use. So I'll typically send this to people. So it's like, okay, we're going to talk about, so you got to write this down, send it to your guest ahead of time. We're going to talk about your background, how customers or clients or peers are innovating their products or services, stories about your experience, what is technology doing to change your industry, and I'm going to say, I'm going to do a little intro. So this was actually an interview with Steve Haber, right? I haven't put it out there yet. I own that. But I said, this is what we're going to talk about, leadership development from a leader. And then sometimes at the start of the show, ahead of time, we'll work on this a little bit. Like, is there anything you want to talk about? I'm like, well, I really just launched a new product. I'd like to talk about that. Or, you know, I'd like to talk about this. I wouldn't like to talk about this. You give them a little say in it, you know? And typically I try to come up with like maybe 15, 20 questions. That's enough to fill an hour. And then you have to just start, you have to be kind of just have a conversation, right? Which most of the time isn't that hard. Sometimes it can be hard, you know, if people are just not very conversational. It can be hard to like, you know, you feel like you're pulling teeth. It's rare for me that that's been the case. And then there's things like people aren't used to talking to the microphone being recorded. They need to warm up. So the technique I learned is to start out, get all the sound levels to say, so tell me about your first car. What was your first car? Everybody has a first car, right? Yeah. And they say, well, it was a 1987 Subaru sedan and da-da-da-da, right? And you check the levels and you get them comfortable and get them warmed up, you know, and then you say, okay, now we're going to start. So that's some of the things I do. And then at the end, I always try to make sure to ask them to share their contact information, so they get that chance to sort of mention their website, sort of stuff like that. But yeah, other than that, I mean, it may, I know there's a lot of steps to it and it may sound a little bit daunting. It's really not that bad. If you follow, most of the best advice you can find to do it easily would be, you know, on these hosted sites like Podbean and Libsyn. I mean, they're used to people just starting out, right? That's what they do. But really, honestly, for me, the biggest thing is it has been way easier for me to create big piles of content. Like sitting down and talking to a microphone for an hour versus slaving away trying to get a blog post out that I just was supposed to publish 2 weeks ago, and I'm not happy with it yet, and I gotta revise it some more, and I just never get that done. I mean, I've been working on a book for like 30 years ago, so it's so hard to get through that. The podcast, I found, you can sit down, you can churn it out, get it out, boom, done, send it to the editor, and then do 50 a year, you know, and
So your first 5, how much time per podcast did it take you versus now that you've gotten it down, so to speak, how much time?
Well, I mean, my first 5, so I mean, obviously there's a recording time, so like an hour or so for that, right? And then all the editing time, since I was doing that myself. And I was probably trying to edit and delete more than I should have. Like, I mean, I knew it's not that hard to learn to do it in the tool. I mean, when you're in the software, if you want to, you know, if I have some audio that's having some, you see these peaks, for instance, you can just select those, you know, edit. What is it? It's, you know, delete, right? So now that section's gone. So it's not that hard, right? But it's just when you do that 1,000 times of every little, you know, thing, you go overboard, or when you're just struggling with it. So, I mean, I think on those early episodes, I was probably spending 2-3 hours just messing with mixing and music and editing and all this crap. And that was cumbersome, you know, which, like I said, there's that benefit for sure of either not being as picky or having that for sure. And I'd say now, like I said, now it's, you know, record the podcast and email the guy.
So as you're identifying who you want to interview, you're doing the prep for that. There's a variety of things. I mean,
There's like 3 parts is what I'm saying. There's pre-production, right? Write the questions, find the guest, book the time, do all that stuff. Production, actually doing it. And then post-production, editing, getting it ready to go. If I'm missing anything.
No, that's everything you do for a video, so you don't have to worry about how you look and that whole element, which would certainly make it easier, but.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, like, these questions, like, those are the same questions every time, right? Like, with minor variations, you know, so I have a standard script.
Customize it to your audience,
right.
To your speaker.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll I'm going to start over, make a new one, refresh it, you know, but this one I've probably used for 30 episodes, you know. So I always ask, you know, what was your first big break as an entrepreneur? Like, that really made a difference, you know, to kind of start it, you know. If I'm talking to an entrepreneur, if I'm talking to like somebody who's an executive at a Kroger type place, I'm going to say, well, what was your first chance? You know, your first big break, you got to shine it as a manager or something, you know. So there's ways to spin that either way. And then, so there is that, and then there's also just like, so I have this list here of podcast guests, right? And ones that are currently in editing, ones that are recorded, ones that need to reschedule, ones that are pending, ones that are potential. And I just continuously grow that list. I've got some ideas, like I thought maybe I'll do a monologue, you know, like maybe I'll make it about like some stuff, you know, and maybe I'll do some panels, I'll drop those ideas. So I just kind of keep a note list, and then when I need to fill the queue, I reach out to 5, 6 people, and it's rare that anyone says no, unless you reach out to someone really famous or something that's like, well, I don't really go on shows for free. You know?
Do they come to you, or do you go to them, and does it matter?
I mean, I've had both. I mean, most of these folks I've asked to be on my show, but I've had several people, and I've had people reach out to me, and I've also had like agencies reach out to me, like, hey, I have a client want to get on your show. So there's that too. Those are usually a little harder because you don't know the person at all, right? It's